Today on Lead with Bubba Scott, we're talking with Councilman Zac Blanchard of the Baltimore City Council. Zac's leadership perspective is shaped by his time in the Marine Corps, both operationally and while teaching at the Naval Academy. He shares his experience running a political campaign and navigating the challenging path of passing legislation in contemporary American politics, all while remaining a committed family man and a leader of integrity. Let's get it. Zac Blanchard, welcome to the show. How are we doing?
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, Bubba.
Yeah, it's incredible that you agreed to join us. How are things out in Baltimore?
Good. Staying busy. 11 months into the job, we've hit a couple goals legislatively early on, which is great. Obviously, plenty more work to do. Fulfilling but demanding, so that's good.
Yeah, it's good to be both fulfill and in demand, I think. So, Zac, you're not originally from Baltimore. Where are you from?
Yeah, Louisiana. So Southwest Louisiana on the Texas border. Went to, obviously, like you, went to the Naval Academy. My wife went to Wake Forest, but is from Montgomery County, which is just north of D.C. in Maryland. So we met, as you know, on a Glee Club trip down when we were in Winston-Salem. She ended up moving to Baltimore after college, was off doing Marine stuff for a while, managed to get stationed back at the Naval Academy for my last tour of active duty. And that's when we bought our house just south of downtown in Baltimore.
Yeah, that's incredible. So the tie to Baltimore certainly makes a lot of sense. You talked about growing up in Louisiana and then heading on to the Naval Academy. I'm kind of interested what it was like growing up down there and then what drew you ultimately to head to Annapolis.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a pretty rural area and didn't have a super clear sense of what I wanted to do after high school. Grew up in Friday Night Lights country and was a decent high school football player. So there was a couple of colleges in the area back home that was kind of my goal to go play football at. But nothing more defined than that. I ended up getting a copy of the Princeton Review's 365 like best colleges, and I'm flipping through, and they have like these the quick facts on the side of it, and I see tuition $0. I'm like, whoa, what is this? It was the Air Force Academy. And so my dad had been an enlisted Marine back in the day. So like, well, if I'm going to do the military or do the service academy, I'm going to do the Naval Academy. And so ended up getting really interested. I went and did the week-long simulated freshman summer, right before my senior year, and absolutely loved it. Felt really great. And I applied to Naval Academy and MIT, got into both, and was trying to decide, which way to go, and had the opportunity to meet some midshipmen and some students in MIT, and certainly not a knock at all in that institution, but just was kind of like, which one of these types of graduates do I want to be more like? And felt like I wanted to be more like what I felt the Naval Academy was producing. So that was how I made the decision.
Yeah. So basically you saw the caliber of person and the type of person who's running around campus on the yard, and you were like, that's where I want to be.
Yeah. I mean, the high caliber, sure, in one sense, but also just, I felt having a sense of mission to something outside yourself that was clear. The sense of service that was big, particularly for, a teenager, the discipline, the physical fitness, those were just kind of the serious mindedness to the whole thing were all things that I was like, yeah, I want this.
This is only our second episode, and our first episode had an opportunity to sit down with Joe Thomas. We talked a lot about how plebe summer, even though it's so formative for the young people who are stepping into their first year at the academy, how that really is, there's a huge component that's designed for leadership growth for the people in the company commander, squad leader billets.
And I'll just say something that was really cool was when I was back at the academy as an instructor, 6-7 years after that, I remember hearing some of the rising seniors who had just done plebe summer talking to each other and being like, it really feels like it's more for the seniors than it is for the freshmen, and how valuable that leadership development is. And I remember thinking the same thing and talking to our peers when we were going through it. So it was pretty cool to flash forward, the better part of a decade later and hearing midshipmen still talking about it and thinking about it in that sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's incredible that you had the opportunity to go back and teach there and see it from the other perspective, and not as a company officer, correct? You were instructing.
Yeah, I taught the American government course for the freshmen. So I did that, and then I low-key recruited midshipmen in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, hey, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
So just real quick, you taught at the academy. That's only possible if you have a master's degree. So can you just talk about You graduated from the academy, you were going into the Marines, but how did you get that higher level education and where did you go?
Yeah. There's a small number of spots after you graduate from the Naval Academy for folks to go and do a 1 or 2 year master's before you go into your Navy Marine Corps service. So I was able to go to University of Cambridge in England for a year. I did African studies, spent a lot of time mostly in Kenya, but in Tanzania and Uganda as well, and looking at where the rubber meets the road of local politics and when regular people got mad about politics, how they interacted with the political system, which turns out in my current day job is fast forward 10 years later. And I was like, oh, that's really apropos, which is a total fluke. And I'll say that 2 things that were really valuable coming out of that was, the Naval Academy, that education is, thorough and very demanding, but it's very broad. And one thing that was awesome about my master's was I was in class for 4 hours a week outside of language class. So you're doing a ton of reading. I had 5 grades the whole year. They were all papers. They're all longer papers, right? So you're doing a ton of reading, a ton of writing, a ton of talking about the stuff you're reading and writing about with other folks, and you're getting the opportunities to travel and think through all these things while you're doing that. And that was really cool. And that was, I think, a really great addition to my intellectual development in a way that's really distinct from what the academy excels at developing. And the other part about my year in Cambridge that was super helpful was both the time that I was spending just kind of talking to folks in central and western Kenya and noticing things, the aspects of those communities that I was spending time in, processing it while I was in Cambridge and just comparing it back to what I grew up with and what we have in the U.S. There was a lot of things, particularly when it comes to sense of community and social connectedness and the importance of belonging to both physical place and to a group of people, that were completely stuck with me and were absolutely transformative in the types of ways that I was like, this is what I want to do with my life. And I didn't know if I wanted to be an academic studying what is the impact of, newspapers on, or having or not having newspapers on sense of communities in towns or neighborhoods, or if I wanted to actually go be a practitioner, but I know I wanted to do that. And when I was in the Marine Corps doing regular platoon commander type stuff, I was reading these types of books and things like that. And so that was really formative for me. So when I had the opportunity to move back with my wife, who was in Baltimore, we decided to live in Baltimore instead of in the suburbs in between Baltimore and Annapolis, because we knew that we wanted to live near neighbors and be around other people and be in a place that had a history and whatnot. And being involved, and immediately got involved in a bunch of different community things. And that sort of propelled me into the decision to run for office.
Yeah, that's incredible, man. I actually did not realize that in the course of your studies at Cambridge, you were traveling and getting on the ground in Africa. That's incredible. And then it's so interesting because we have the luxury of sometimes being a little bit more openly critical now that we're no longer in the Marine Corps. I absolutely love the Marine Corps. You'll find no bigger fan than me, but I think that the Marine Corps oftentimes does itself a disservice with the way that it looks at academia and education. And while it's certainly, there are a ton of great opportunities to learn within the Marine Corps and some of the best professional military education. And of course, there are great programs to go study at great universities, but they're much more limited comparatively. And you look at our buddies who are in the Navy and here I am at Wharton. I've got classmates who are still active duty, who are at, one of the top business school programs in the world. And I really wish the Marine Corps would take a little bit broader approach to that and have a little bit more of an open mind on it, because it sounds like, specifically in your example, that experience on the ground, which took place underneath the academic degree construct in Africa, really broadened your perspective and gave you a lot of insight on how, different groups connect and how they interact with each other. And I can think of, no better preparation for a young person who's about to go step in front of a platoon of Marines. That sounds awesome. And I think yours is an example of why we really should encourage higher level education within the officer corps across the United States military, but certainly more so in the Marine Corps.
When it comes to these topics of intellectualism or innovation, which I think is in some ways a similar type of both are pushing to do things besides the thing that everyone does. Something that I always kind of like to point out about the Marine Corps, the whole culture of the Marine Corps is built around having a 23-year-old with a college degree be able to tell a 22-year-old without a college degree to go take some 19-year-olds and go kill a guy who's shooting at them with a machine gun, right? And so it's there's a specific culture in the Marine Corps, and it really has very real strengths and also kind of downsides to it. So you're always kind of playing within that dynamic, I think. But I'll also say that if you look back to the 80s and 90s, the Commandant's reading list, these are the professional books that, are recommendations for starting to expand your horizons and encouraging Marines to read and whatnot. There was actually huge pushback against that. The idea that Marines should be reading, there was pushback against that in the 80s and early 90s. So that is, in perspective, there's kind of always been that sort of kind of anti-intellectual streak balancing with the Jim Mattis's or the General Gray, right? The legendary commandant of the Marine Corps in the early 90s. So it's a bit of a yin and a yang there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's certainly a balance where, you have to balance thinking with action. And I think that, it would be foolhardy of either of a proponent of intellectual thought and critical thinking. It would be foolhardy of that person to be critical of people who execute something ruthlessly and with a total purpose in mind. But on the other side of that, it's foolhardy as well to assume that someone who has this higher level education would somehow, hesitate in the face of danger or something like that. So I definitely hear you loud and clear. I just remember thinking back, and I'm sure there are many midshipmen who were there, who were at the academy while you were there, who might think this of you, but I remember being there and looking up to guys like Aaron McLean, Nick Schmitz, and my brother, all of whom I thought of as just like these gods who were both battle-hardened, war-fighting leaders who had multiple tours in some of our nation's toughest wars, but also were incredibly well-educated, Rhodes Scholars, UK Scholar, Marshall Scholars. And to me, that was the apogee of what a Marine officer could be. And I'm glad that the Academy is still prizing that. And I think the UK Scholar Program and all the programs, to include, a lot of help from our classmate, Drew Calcagna, with his scholarship, giving opportunities to people to pursue that next level of intellectual growth before they step into the shoes of a junior officer.
Yeah. How wild is it that we have a classmate who's endowed a scholarship? Isn't that wild?
It's absolutely wild, and it's even more insane until you talk to him and you see all the things that he's getting into and getting after, and I'm pretty excited. We're hopefully going to be able to have him on the show here soon.
It was wild that he was endowing a scholarship, opportunity as a 29-year-old, I think. It's like,
no, it's incredible. It's definitely incredible. And it kind of speaks to his commitment. And I think what we just discussed, I think he would agree
for sure.
Very, very much that it's good to make our military leaders smart. Hot take. Anyway, so that was really great. We were able to cover a lot there. And we touched a little bit on why you wanted to move to Baltimore. I'd be very interested, since you're on the council, why should other people move to Baltimore? It makes sense why you guys move there. Why should young professionals and families move to the great city of Baltimore?
Yeah. That's a fun question. So you have the opportunity to have a walkable, historic, vibrant, diverse city that you can actually afford to buy a home in. I think that sums it up, I think, pretty well. I'm a huge nerd proponent for row home neighborhoods. Row homes are townhomes, right? Where you have every 16 feet is a new home and they share a party wall. And it's historic. It feels like you're in a place, like an actual place. It's really easy to meet your neighbors. That's sort of built into the architecture of where you live. I mean, I have two little ones, a soon to be 3-year-old and a soon to be 1-year-old. Sometimes I take the bus. I take them on the bus to daycare and then walk to work. Sometimes I have the 3-year-old on the bike seat and then the baby in a trailer. And so I bike them there and then bike to work. And once every couple of weeks I drive if I have something else going on and so it's just, there's things that you can't do and sort of a way of feeling about your place that you can't have if you live in a suburb, to use that as an example. And then also I'll say that something that's really important to me, I coach high school football and I have for 4 years, and I coach at a high school that the high school is actually in my neighborhood, but kids come from all over the city, and about 70% of the kids are like economically disadvantaged, which is a lot higher than national averages. And I represent several communities in my district as a council member who are sort of socioeconomically in that space. And I just feel like it's really important to actually be fighting for a fair society, a society where you can't just look at huge swaths of a large city and be like, wow, all these people are being screwed just by being born with the conditions they were born in. Right. And so, if there's the sense of community aspect, and then there's like a fighting against sort of a status quo that screws over a lot of people. And I feel like I've been blessed for the opportunity to have both of those where I am.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to kind of sum that up, the way I'm hearing it is, you identified this fantastic community with a lot of stuff going on, that you and your wife were very excited about and wanted to be a part of, and then also you couple that with kind of this sense of growth and how you can inject yourself to hopefully enrich the experience for everyone as a part of that community. Is that right?
Yeah. It feels like you're a part of something bigger than yourself, and that there's important things that need to be done in a way that, there are places we could have lived that you probably wouldn't have had that opportunity.
Yeah. So for a guy who played football growing up and joining the Marines, it was important for you to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And I'm glad to hear that you found it. So,
Yeah.
it's clear just talking about your background and the things that you were able to do both academically during your studies, and also kind of the leadership aspect of your non-academic side of life in school, and then your time in the Marine Corps. It's clear that, you're a servant leader who wants to make the world a better place, to put it in the most dramatic terms possible. And it makes a lot of sense to me too now why you moved to Baltimore, and the places where Baltimore is incredibly rich in terms of the experience, and places where it can improve. You obviously wanted to make an impact there. What I'm pretty interested in is, there are a lot of ways to make an impact. Of course, you've got commerce, you've got nonprofits, you've got government. I'm pretty interested kind of holistically, like why did you decide you wanted to go into government? Why did you decide you wanted to run? And
Yeah.
then ultimately, why the city council? Because, we're going to have people listening to this from different parts of the country. It'd be interesting to hear how does city council function, and then why were you drawn to that over the other avenues for lending a hand?
Yeah. So when I was getting out of the Marine Corps, we had been in Baltimore for 3 years. We already had, I think, deep relationships with kind of the community and the place that we were in. And so I wasn't moving, and that was a big part of the reason I got out of the Marine Corps, was because I'm not moving, and I knew I wanted to do Baltimore stuff. So it was, I'm looking around for what to do. I freelanced a couple articles, sort of long form investigative journalism type stuff. Like, hey, maybe I want to, be in journalism. Maybe I want to, we have a vacant housing crisis with blighted buildings and whatnot. So, I was looking into getting into the rehabbing of those properties, multiple different things like that. And because of all the ways I was involved, coaching football, doing different things with my church that were community related, and it was really involved with the neighborhood association, different things like that. I ran into my predecessor as the councilperson in a couple ways that not to beat a dead horse, but, just felt like, man, we should have different leadership, in this seat. And so it was kind of a put up or shut up thing, because no one had challenged him in 2020. It didn't really look like someone was going to challenge him. I happened to be getting out, I actually had a friend who had run on the state level and had lost a really close race on the state level, and was like, "Yeah, you should think about running for the city council race." And so it wasn't necessarily a city versus state versus whatever else. It was kind of fell into the position of, this is where I really feel like there needs to be change happening. So that was sort of the driving thing. All that being said, I will say that one thing that's great about being a legislator on the city level is, I think there's a lot of like shared understanding about our challenges and our opportunities and what our constituents and neighbors want and prioritize and whatnot. That just with the larger the government gets, the harder that gets, right? I think it's a bit of, you could imagine a rural Republican congressperson in the House of Representatives, and, a suburban Democratic congressperson having really, really different worldviews and priorities and representing very different groups of people with different problems and all that type of stuff. And certainly there's a lot of differences, across the city of Baltimore, but there's also a lot of shared things and shared understanding as well. I also am I'm a really big feminist. I am really interested in, how do we drive down the cost of housing? How do we make it easier to get around without a car? How do we make it to where you can walk to get groceries or walk to work or do all these different things, right? And just making neighborhoods nice places that just feel nice to live in or be in. And so that's something that you really can touch very directly on the local level. Whereas there's a lot of other policy things that you can't address on the local level. So if you feel really strongly about, um, immigration being a great example, you're a lot more limited in what you can do locally, right? Than with what the type of stuff that kind of cut my teeth on.
Yeah, that's incredible. Two things that really stick out to me. One, your reasoning behind going into local government, I think, is really admirable because I think that, it's pretty normal for an American to get really focused on the federal politics, federal political issues, federal
Sure.
offices and that kind of thing. A lot of people show up for, who's running for president. A lot of
Presidential
people.
elections. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like fewer people show up for those local ones. But interestingly, and this was my experience growing up in a small town in New Hampshire, it was actually those small town halls where the things would be talked about, discussed, and ultimately passed into legislation, or, that made a huge impact on your life. And it was always crazy to me that people wouldn't go and vote on those things, but they'd go vote on, who was running for the federal election when those folks were going to have very little impact on your day-to-day life. Of course, very important jobs as well, but I would love to see that same level of passion that you're bringing to the local government kind of spread throughout the rest of our, I think it'd be good for our country. That's how the whole thing was stood up, back in
Yeah.
Plymouth Rock and back in the day. People were doing a lot of town halls and a lot of meetings at the town square and things
Yeah.
like that. So
So
that's really cool.
Tocqueville's analysis of, the whole democracy in America thing is I think that's a spot on. There would be, I think, a lot of good things that would come out of more involvement in local democracy. Now, part of that too is a leadership challenge for, I think, people in elected office or in other leadership positions and in a municipality to help make people understand why it matters, right? Because if
Yeah.
they're hearing from TV or social media or whatever, hey, here's all the reasons you should care about things on the national level. And all you ever hear about on the local level, and I get this all the time, is like, oh yeah, local government, that makes sure, they make sure that your trash gets collected. We do make sure that your trash gets collected and a million other things too, right? And so it is, whether it's schools, whether it's public safety, whether it's, um, transit, whether it's, a lot of time local tax structure and, how businesses are supported and whatnot. We are thoroughly in the mix of all that. Right. And so I think that, something that's been cool with the package of housing bills, and I know we'll get the chance to talk about it, but, there's kind of been in the past kind of a, hey, council members do constituent services. They respond to constituents. Yes, we absolutely do that. But we also are legislators, who are passing laws and budgets for the city. And if you're not doing substantive, like big, meaningful legislative work, then there's really no reason to think that there's no reason to expect that the city is going to be substantially different in 5 years than it is now. Right. And so if you're not happy with the status quo and you have legislators who are not meaningfully working to address the status quo, you're probably going to get the status quo. Right. And so being able to give people some reason to understand like what you would do and like that is important and will actually matter in their lives and you're fighting for it is something that if you don't have that, like, why would you blame regular people for, not saying you were doing this, but like, why would we blame regular people for not understanding why this stuff is important?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. It is easy to, kind of assess people as not caring or not paying attention, but as much, I think that falls very much on the backs of the people in leadership positions, like you said,
Yeah.
in terms of getting the word out and encouraging people to show up because of what's at stake. When my mom was a select woman in the town of Plymouth, they would have these really important meetings. And, it was a very small town. And when people wouldn't come to the meetings, it would be, it would make the passing of whatever they were doing a lot more difficult. And so that level of communication of getting people to come down, which, she was able to do, and we're certainly going to talk about in your case as well, is absolutely huge. And I think that's a really interesting insight on your part to say, hey, as much as it's incumbent on, the Baltimorean or the American to study his or her politics and understand what's going on and impacting their lives, it's a two-way street. And it's absolutely important for leaders in public positions to be reaching out and communicating, because people have their own lives. They voted for you to represent them so that they can continue to work the job that's feeding their family. And, that's one of the
Yeah.
many sacred things that you're in charge of, representing those people. So we talked about that was really great. We talked about some interesting insights in terms of why city council and what you guys are actually knocking out. And we're definitely going to get into some of the legislature that you passed. But before we do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you just moved to Baltimore. You were there for 3 years. You met this, you identified that there could be perhaps a different way of engaging with the people in the position of a council member in your district. And so you decided you were going to run. You don't go from thinking about running to being the councilman. There's a ton of work that goes in that. So that'd be really interesting. And can you kind of tell the story about your campaign, what that was like, and some of the challenges that you faced?
Yeah, totally. So I campaigned, um, kind of full speed campaigning from like beginning of December of 23 to Tuesday, May 14th of 2024. And so, I mean, it was, out at on Saturday and Sundays, out at 9 a.m., door knocking until it gets dark. Basically every Saturday and Sunday, holding meet and greets several nights a week. You trying to get I was running against a really well-known, fairly popular and historically well-funded incumbent. And so there was a lot of, I knocked on, I think about 7,000 doors, in the campaign, but I'm also, had a lot of awesome volunteers who I had about 40 people I would text every Monday morning and be like, hey, can you knock a shift Saturday morning or Sunday afternoon or whatever? Hey, can you knock a shift this upcoming weekend? And I had my Excel doc and I was, all right, this person's this, boom, boom, boom. Here's our Saturday morning shift. You've got these sets of blocks. You've got these blocks. You've got these blocks. So that there's a very thorough grassroots effort involved in that. I'll say a couple other things. One, I was publicly financed. So, our race was the first race. It was the first time in Baltimore that we had this option where the traditional campaign model is in Maryland is you can get up to $6,000 per person or from a company or from, a PAC or a union or whatever. It caps at 6,000. But so like, you, your wife, your company, y'all can each donate 6,000, right? And so, public financing it caps it at $150 and it has to be an actual person. But there was a match, taxpayer funded match, for small contributions from city residents, right? So a city resident could donate $75 to your campaign, and that would become $500 with how the match was calculated. And so, I was able to get 500 something people to donate, $50, $75, $150, and it came out to about $160,000. And so that was a really important thing to my campaign, not just because I was able to raise a pretty good amount of money, $160,000, but also to be able to say, I'm doing this different, right? I'm fundraising from regular people who live here, and I'm not going to owe anybody anything when I win, right? So it's not what I would say when I was knocking on doors is I'm publicly financed, which means that if I say I believe something, I actually mean it. I'm not just getting paid to act like it, which was a little hyperbolic of a way to explain it, but so that was an important part of the campaign. On the leadership side, two kind of maybe quick, interesting leadership-ish tidbits, 3 maybe. One, I was having to decide if I wanted a campaign manager or not. And I'd gotten some good advice from a group that helps veterans prepare to run for office. And they said, hire slow, fire fast. And I had a short period of time, so I couldn't really hire slow. But basically, I was like, should I have a campaign manager or should I just run it all myself? And, because people who know what they're doing, and I have experience in that, they're not managing a city council campaign race, right? They're managing large mayoral races or state races and, congressional races, things like that. And so I had a guy and I was like, hey, I'm going to hire you on, but full disclosure, if it doesn't work, I don't have 6 months to train you up on how to do this. Right. And I'm not going to have an endless amount of money. So I ended up, I didn't fire him. But I basically repositioned him as he was just door knocking, and I would pay him to door knock on Saturday and Sundays. Him and then a couple teenagers were the only people I was paying to door knock. And so that was a really good, glad I was able to manage through that. Cause I could have, really missed out on a lot. That's one. Two, I met with a public speaking coach a couple times. Biggest thing that I took out of that is, if it takes you, you should be spending 40% of your time writing your speech and 60% practicing it. And you should practice your speech at least 6 times before you ever actually give it. And it always kind of,
Wow.
just the way that I had done things, anytime I had to give a speech for something, I would spend all my time thinking about saying the perfect thing and never actually practicing the speech. And so the strategy may have been good, but the execution was bad. And so when I learned to do that, that actually was super valuable and is definitely something that I have actually used from that. And when I don't, I can feel it. I can
Yeah.
tell when I'm publicly speaking when I haven't properly prepared, I'm like, this is really, bad on me. But
Yeah. Yeah.
so those two things, and then shucks, what was the other? Yeah, here's one that is not applicable in a Marine Corps sense, or had never really come across anything like this. So I had the group that helps veterans run, they had given me a free campaign advisor who I was meeting with once a week. And he was, hey, have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about doing that? And he was phenomenal and would not have wanted it without him. But there was a point when, I'm knocking on these doors and people can be really vibing with what I'm saying. And then I say, all right, can I count on your vote? And I'd get some like, well, that type of thing at the end of the conversation. And he was like, Zach, voters don't vote for a challenger. They vote against the incumbent. He's like, you're going to have to give them a reason to not vote for the guy who's in office. And I was like, no, I want to talk about what I'm here for. I want to talk, I want to run on my own. I'm not trying to undercut the other guy, even though I actually personally, I have really very strong opinions about sort of his leadership in the district. And he was like, well, if you want to win, you got to do it. And so we ended up, a couple of our mailers will direct, hey, here's what he's doing. Here's why you shouldn't vote for him. And I was definitely not comfortable with the idea at all. But there was a couple of suggested things that we do. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Or that's hyperbolic. That's not actually what he said, or that's not a fair that's a misleading depiction of him. And so I did nix those things, but I did become through in our mail, about half of my mail was split between here's why you should vote for Zach and here's why you should not vote for the incumbent. And I, looking back, definitely would not have won without it. And I think there's just something to be said about an aspect of leadership being just recognizing what has to happen to accomplish the mission sometimes, even when it's totally not what you would want it to be. There's a risk of wishful thinking your way out of a situation that is, as a leader, you can't do it, right? Or else you're not going to accomplish the thing that you're leading towards. And at the end of the day, I ended up winning a super close race. Out of 7,000 something votes, I won by 48 votes. So 24 changed opinions, is a 48 vote swing. Wow. And it actually took 9 days after, with all the mail in coming in and all the absentee ballots being counted, for the race to be declared. It was not a productive week of work for me, but
that's
so
crazy.
Yeah.
Dude, that really stands out to me. Obviously you're getting guidance from someone who has so much experience. Then they really want to see you succeed. They really want to see you win. And they're giving you some guidance about how you need to kind of get your gloves dirty, or whatever the saying is, where you got to go in and we need you to get negative in your campaigning. And I think I really admire the way that you handle that, because yes, I think historically I'm not comfortable going fully negative. I'm not going to do certain things because it's just not the type of man that I am, because I'm a person of character, and I'm not going to be misleading or tell untruths about somebody. Like, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's a really great point. Like, you heard what the guidance was, or what the advice was. You gleaned the important part about it, which is you do realistically need to show that the reason why you're running is this other person, or, the outcomes that you're seeing are not in line with your vision. And you
Yeah.
need to help show people why your vision is stronger, or, how you're providing an alternative to something that you don't like. But you can totally do that in a manner that's still respectful of another person who ultimately is, for better or for worse. I don't know this other person, but there's something to be said about someone who actually is running for office. So even if
Yeah.
they do certain things for the wrong reasons or have the wrong ideas, like, they're still trying to make their community be a better place. And I think it's a discredit to the community when we're overtly disrespectful in our discourse. So I really admire the way that you manage that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, brief aside, very well said. Brief aside, just about, I think, how politics works, that only, I think you really only have to go negative when you're running against an incumbent, right? When it's an open seat and there's multiple people running, or if you're an incumbent running against challengers who are presumably much less known than you are. Like, I feel like it's unlikely that you would need to go beyond like, hey, this person supports this policy. I think that policy is a bad idea. Or if there's any, like, obviously in the case of like severe, like ethical or like legal transgressions, right? Like, flagging those is always completely appropriate, right? Because that is important for voters to know. Balancing that
Absolutely.
is
Well, and it's interesting too, just on this topic, like the famous clip of John McCain defending
yeah,
Barack Obama. It's like McCain lost, but guess what? He didn't lose, like his dignity and the respect of the American people. Whereas, so many people who are running for office today, they might win an election, but they're absolutely like bereft of a core of ethics. And like,
yeah,
they're going to live with that for their whole lives. You might be in office for a period of time, but like, you can't turn back and take back some of the dirty stuff that a lot of these folks are doing. So a lot of respect for keeping it clean, and just being a good dude. Be a
yeah,
good
yeah.
dude. Always good
Yeah,
advice.
I definitely Senator McCain an absolute credit to the notion that the Naval Academy builds people of character. I think he was, speaking as a Democrat myself, I think he was absolutely a great credit to what the institution says it does.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you kind of, irrespective of your party, I think that's a good example of someone who can have his core beliefs but treat other people with dignity and respect. Although, of course, like all heroes, he had his own flaws.
Sure.
He's about as good as they come in my mind. So I definitely want to hop in on hoop, if I'm saying that right. So you just passed some your first bit of legislation. I think it's got a lot of people excited. And it sounds hard won, but well won. And I'd love to just hear what are some of the issues that you guys are addressing, and how is it going to make the
Yeah.
average Baltimorean's day better?
Yeah, yeah. So it's the Housing Options and Opportunities Package. 5 different bills, really 4 main bills. 4 of the 5 have just passed and were signed into law by the mayor 2 weeks ago. And there's one more that, as of this recording, we are going to start the committee hearing on this upcoming Thursday. So the intent of the bills is to address the cost and availability of housing, both rent and home ownership. The idea is we need to make it easier for people to get the type of housing they want in the neighborhood they want at a price they can afford. And we have some historic things put into our zoning and building codes that either incidentally or intentionally make it hard to do that, right? Artificially drive up the cost by limiting the types of housing we can have in the city. And so the 2 main ones, my bill said, okay, we're not going to there's no more mandating that there be off-street parking minimums for anything that's being built. And we had already had a lot of carve outs for apartment buildings and single family homes and things like that. Smaller business buildings. But the idea is, if you were going to put into law that every new unit of housing needs a jacuzzi room with a jacuzzi in it, obviously that would make it not just A, more expensive, but also B, would make it harder to have. You'd end up with less housing and it would be more expensive. And the same exact thing is happening with parking, especially in a city where a third of the households don't have a car, either by choice or by necessity. It's like, why would you mandate it? Obviously, the primary concern of that was, does this mean that there's going to be more people parking in my neighborhood, right? I live in a city neighborhood. Nobody, including myself, Zach, likes looking for parking. So a lot of stress inducing going on there. And so that was one of the two main ones. The other big one is in Baltimore City, as well as in a lot of country, there's large residential portions where you can't have more than one home on a single property. That was put into place in a lot of cities nationwide, including in Baltimore in the 1920s, as a intentional effort to make white neighborhoods too expensive for Black families to move into. Historically, this is why that was being introduced. It was in response to a Supreme Court decision that said the Supreme Court decision in 1917 said, hey, you can't mandate racial exclusions into zoning codes.
That's a good ruling, I'd say.
Yeah. No, they got that one right. And a lot of cities respond to that by saying, okay, well, if we can't say that Black people can't live here, what we will say is that you can't build the types of housing that lower income people could afford here. And we know that will, lead towards, Black families, immigrant families, and low income people in general not being able to live in certain areas. And so there's all sorts of, so we're getting rid of that in the zoning code. And there's all sorts of concerns with some of it well-intentioned about what will this do to homeownership opportunities. Some of it more concerned about the types of people who could theoretically be moving into my neighborhood. But so leadership wise, I had a really interesting situation with my staff and I were talking about this right before we made the announcement that we were introducing the bills. Me and a couple other council members, the council president and the mayor were all aligned on this, but a lot of the council was not. Right. So there was no guarantees at all. And so I'm sitting there talking to my staff and we're like, do we just kind of introduce this and let it go and see what happens? Or do we really have an active campaign to try to explain to people why we're doing this and change people's opinions? And I was like, no, I believe in this. I believe in this and I can go and talk to people. So I will, I did barnstorming where I went to every neighborhood association in my district, some other neighborhood associations across the city if they expressed concern or whatever. Every single email that I got about the package, I would respond to, or at least one per person, right? Some people would send multiple emails, right? But I told my staff, every email about this package, I'm going to respond. If someone calls, I personally will call them back. I am not hiding behind anything. I believe in this. I think this may not be immediately intuitive to people why this is important, but we have a very important reason that we're fighting for this. And I think it led to a situation where I think a lot of people were on board, certainly in my districts, and even a lot of people who were not on board, I think got to the point where they're like, okay, I wouldn't do this, but I understand why Zach is doing it, and I can live with it. And that's very different from like, you are actively trying to destroy my neighborhood. Like, I hate you, right? Which is a very real way that voters will feel about, city council people sometimes. The Parks and Rec sort of classic example of just being screamed at over things that you may or may not have anything at all to do with is sometimes applicable. And so that was something that, and I think my colleagues on the council, even the ones, my bill passed with an 8-6 vote. We had one member who was absent who would have also been a no. So we passed it with 8 of the 15 votes. And so it was a skin of the teeth thing. But even most of the members who voted no, I think, really appreciated my efforts to explain and talk to them and try to figure out how we could come to something and whatnot. And so, the next time that we try to do something like this, we haven't poisoned the well, right? And or if they try to do whatever, right? There's a trusting relationship between people, 2 of the 15 people have to vote on stuff, right? That it's really easy when you feel differently, when you feel strongly and differently on an important issue to have that kind of seep into an animosity towards the other person, which there's 1,000 other things we're going to have to work on in this 4 years, right? And so knowing how to both disagree, collaborate when you can, and then recognize when it's like, all right, we'll move on to the next one, right, is I think a really important balance. Doesn't really have a lot of analogs that I think in my life before elected office. I'd be curious if any of your listeners, actually in this line of work, this type of thing happens. It might be sort of unique-ish to being a legislator. But
yeah. Well, I certainly think, there's so much to unpack there. You knew you had a slight majority and you still decided to be collegial and respectful. And so, like you said, you didn't poison the well, so you'll be able to work together going forward. And I think that's a lesson that would be really wonderful if we could elevate that to our federal
Yeah.
politicians. So I think that'd be really great. If they could be collegial and respectful with each other. I think what this really comes out to, man, is the why. You know what I mean? And giving people the why. In any team, the person in the authority position or the person who can pull the lever, as your case as a council member, you can pull levers. Like you can pull the lever, right? And some people aren't gonna like it, some people are dislike it. But when you share why you're doing it, people can understand. So a couple things that stand out to me about that is it's clearly a theme in your leadership style where you're sharing your thought process with people. And I think that, that level of education and sharing your mindset, it's the greatest level of respect that you can give to a group of people whom either you're representing or whom you're leading, right? You're sharing your thought process with them because you respect their views, you respect their opinions, you respect their time. You're not just going to do things unilaterally. And then also it speaks of your confidence and your conviction in what you're doing because you're like, I don't need to hide what I'm doing. I'm going to
Yeah.
share it with these people because I really believe in it. I think that reasonable people, the people that I represent in Baltimore, who are all reasonable, good people, they're going to they're going to jive with what I'm saying. And if they don't, they're at least going to understand and appreciate the amount of time I put into it. And that's exactly the type of thing that was relevant in the Marine Corps. As an officer,
Mm,
you could bark an order and the guys are going to do it. But
yeah.
your organization was never going to have a healthy culture unless you're giving them the why. And every time you give them the why, you build that rapport. They understand your mindset. They understand that you respect them, value their time, value their views. So then when it's game time and you don't have the time to give them the why and you've just got to execute, they're going to do it because they
Yeah.
know that
Because you have
you
that.
have their backs.
Yeah. Yeah. The trust is speed of trust. Covey's book is
Yeah,
one of my like 2 or 3 favorite like leadership books of all time. And hadn't actually thought about it from that perspective, but that's a really, I think, spot on thing that permeates like a lot of different sort of aspects of society. It's mentioned coach high school football and I coached special teams and we had, one of our kick returners came to me early in the season. He was like, "Hey coach, I think we should go from 2 kick returners to 3." I was like, "Okay, why?" And having 3 guys back on the kick return. And, he taught me through it and I thought about it. I was like, "All right, let me, follow up about this on Monday." And he brought it back up. And actually, I thought about it. I think here's why it probably doesn't make sense for us to do that. And he really appreciated that, right? Continue to come with ideas and stuff. Whereas, particularly with football coaches can kind of be like, "I'm the coach, shut up." Sometimes in the culture,
exactly. Yeah.
but there's a trusting aspect to that, and he's still engaged in thinking himself, right? If I just shut him down, he also wouldn't be actively thinking, right? And you need people on, the ground level, the players in this case, to be thinking, right? You need everyone to be thinking, even if at the end of the day, it's one person who's going to make the decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you alienate the people who are coming to ideas with you, you're not going to be able to tap into
Yeah.
the wonderful ideas
And in my
that
job, if
people
you alienate
have.
all those people, you won't be in your job for long, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I've got just one more question about hoop, but I understand reading about this whole process that you guys did have some town halls or some open meetings with the
Yep.
public and some of them got pretty big. What was the biggest one and what was that energy like being in a council meeting with that many people?
Yeah. You have a couple hundred people sending in their testimony beforehand, written over email. And then you have the people who are able to
Wow.
make it to the hearing, which a lot of times is in the middle of the day or it's early in the evening or whatever. It's just in downtown, hard for people to get to. And so, you have probably, I don't know, 20, 25 people giving testimony, some for, some against, but the people who are against are like very against. And there was definitely some screaming, definitely some thorough lack of decorum, type of effort. And it can be challenging when feel like you are not, when someone is disrespecting you to continue to balance being firm in your position, but not communicating the disrespect back to them, and we had an example. The council president was in one of the hearings and there was a member of the public who was making a couple of literally baseless accusations about the committee chair and saying he was doing things that were against council rules that they were not. They were totally within the rules and whatnot, but would not cede the floor. He went over time. I thought we might have to call in security. They cut his mic and he just kept like yelling it, well past the time he went. It was, and so that, when we start back up, the council president was like, I appreciate your input. It's so important that the public is engaged and that we're able to balance out all these, different perspectives on this. But if you ever disrespect this one of my committee chairs again, I will have you removed from the council chamber. And said it like that, and I saw the council president who had been he's new council president, but had been a council president for about 8 years, a council member for about 8 years. I was like, wow, that's a really pretty good way in the heat of the moment to balance a very testy situation.
Yeah, that's intense, man. I mean, especially, passion without decorum can be intimidating for sure. That unbridled nature of an angry constituent in a setting like that I would imagine, be intense, but
and you just always have to have something. I'll say is, like, for anyone thinking about running for public office, thin skin is one of the worst traits you can have, because if you're thin skinned, you're going to want to respond. And there's so many ways, kind of underhanded ways as an elected official, that you can like try to get back at somebody. And it's not good for democracy. And it's very corrosive of public trust, And so it is, you have to be thick skinned. And if you're like, oh, I don't think I'm thick skinned, like, I don't know if it'd be a good fit. Like, I think it's just important to remember, like, if you keep like why you're doing it, like why you ran and why you want to be in that position in the first place, kind of at the forefront of your heart, it makes it a little easier to handle when, I had someone send me a very negative email earlier today, that my initial thought was to fire back and a response on, and, keeping those things at the forefront helps.
Yeah, man. That really kind of embodies this idea I've had just as we've been talking is, there are people who run for office for the wrong reasons. And people who want to, put themselves in positions of power for vanity or things like that. I think that it really goes into the nature of what you guys are doing is it's public service. And it is absolutely a sacrifice. I think our nation and our communities deserve ethical leaders. Whatever your political opinions may be, I have full, faith and confidence in you as an ethical person. I think you're just a really good example of a man and someone who's putting himself out there in that position. And I think there are so many things that deter people like you from doing it. And all the great leaders out there who are in the private sector or who are doing work in ways that are hugely impactful, but, they're behind the scenes. Those are all great. But I think these public positions need to be filled by good people. And so it's just really exciting for me to know that there are good people out there doing it. Because, some of the people who are stepping up, when all the good people and all the smart people and all the people who love their families and want to make a difference abstain from entering these offices, that's when we get people, these weirdos in some of these positions that are doing inappropriate and unethical things, not to mention just categorically a bad job in the work that they're doing. So I really appreciate and respect what you're doing. So before we go, I'll ask two questions. If you had to choose one leadership trait for a young leader to look into developing, or one trait that's super important for any young aspiring leader, what would it be?
Listening. I think that being able to intently listen to what people are saying, like you're focused on what they're saying and you're actually processing it, and you're not just sort of passively there while your head's somewhere else or whatever. And then being able, doing that, and then being able to, when appropriate, adjust the plan accordingly. And it's not always going to be appropriate, and it's not always going to, that what people are saying is not always going to be right to adjust to the plan, but being able to say, oh man, I was full bore on this thing, but now I'm hearing all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, actually, they're right. Or this is something that, like with the housing package, we have several different concerns that we've heard across communities, that it's like, okay, heard, definitely that is a real concern. We're still going to pass these bills, but then we're going to address these separate things, on their own. And then I think that's figuring out how to bring that in is going to lead to better ideas and better solutions. And it's also going to lead to better trust between the leader and the people they're leading.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we talked about before, listening and processing what people are saying, accepting it, having the humility to accept when somebody's critique or somebody's idea might be better and taking action on it, but also just by listening, validating the opinions and the thoughts of the people who you work with. I think that's an absolutely great answer and makes a lot of sense. So then, right now it's we're in the middle of November, but what are some of the things coming down the pike for you that you're excited about on the council?
So a couple things. So we've had a proliferation of smoke and vape shops in the city of Baltimore in the last couple years. A good amount of them are effectively selling knockoff weed, or they're doing things like they've got products that are targeting kids, things like that. And so we've got 3 bills coming in that's really putting a very thorough set of guardrails on them that we just introduced a couple weeks ago that I'm really excited about. The kind of that's important, but kind of on the bigger scale, the housing package will mostly directly benefit renters, who are a slight majority of households in the city. And so that's incredibly important. And renters are not usually a super influential group. So I'm really glad that we're doing this. But figuring out ways to adjust what's allowed to be built in the city so that we see more starter homes, the types of home ownership opportunities that are, for young families, someone just out of college or someone, a little lower on the income scale, that they can have opportunities for home ownership. I'm really looking forward to tackling through on that. And then we just have a couple. I'm a huge sucker for main streets. My wife and I actually go to a different main street in Maryland each year for our anniversary. We have some great main streets in the city of Baltimore. It's tough because the city has like 9 or 10 of them, right? And so we can't really prioritize them in the same way that the town of Frederick can prioritize its one kind of downtown area, right? And so I've got sort of a bevy of bills that I'm, working on that I think are going to be really good ways to generate revenue for supporting having these places be really nice, vibrant, pleasant paid places that are great for small businesses, and make people who live in the neighborhood feel good about the neighborhood they live in, and make people who are just coming in to shop feel good about the neighborhood they're in, And so I think probably off the top of my head, those are three things we have, that hopefully over the next year, 2026, we can make some real progress on.
Yeah, definitely important stuff. And I think it's every legislator's duty to have a bevy of bills on call at all times.
As soon as I said bevy of bills, I'm like, I was going to make a joke about this, but
I loved it. I love it. So yeah, just the last thing, man, if people want to learn more about your work or learn more about the Baltimore City Council and the goings on in Baltimore, where can they learn more information?
Yeah. So by the time this podcast airs, I'm going to have my legislative priorities and kind of everything written up in some detail on the website, on my website. And so that would be, a place that folks can look. If you're really willing to dive into this stuff, we do have all of the legislation is publicly posted on Baltimore City Legistar. If anyone wants to dig through all the bills that are being introduced, I'll give a shout out to one of my colleagues, Councilwoman Odette Ramos. She does a weekly 90-second update where she covers legislation that's happening on the city and state level, things that are priorities for hers. But I feel like she does a really good job of it, and it's 90 seconds long. So if someone's like, hey, I want to stay generally abreast of what's going on in the city, give a shout out to that she does. It's pretty good.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, Zac, thank you so much. Councilman in the great city of Baltimore, land of the O's and natty bows, as they say. It's great to chat with you, and thanks so much for sharing your insights on leadership and all the things you're working on in the great city of Baltimore.
Totally. This was awesome. I'm glad you had me on.
Absolutely. Look forward to having you back. Thanks so much for listening to Lead with Bubba Scott. This episode was recorded and edited with Riverside.fm. Theme music developed with Suno AI. If you enjoyed the show, please follow and leave a review wherever you find your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Instagram @LeadWithBubba and let us know your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.